It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I nearly choked on my coffee when I opened the envelope from the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. My monthly fees had skyrocketed to $3,200, a staggering increase that left me speechless. As I sat there, trying to process the news, I glanced out the window and saw our HOA board president, Margaret Collins, cruising down the street in her brand-new Tesla. The irony wasn't lost on me. That car, I was sure, had been bought with our hard-earned money. But what Margaret and her cronies didn't know was that I had just been appointed as the HOA's new external auditor, and they had left behind a paper trail of their schemes so obvious, it was almost laughable. The thick envelope from the HOA felt heavier than usual in my hands that morning. I'd lived in Oakwood Estates for 5 peaceful years, tending to my award-winning roses and keeping to myself. But that peace shattered the moment I pulled out the notice. My monthly HOA fees were tripling, effective in just 30 days. My hand shook as I read the letter again, my coffee forgotten on the kitchen counter. Through the window, I watched Margaret strut down the sidewalk in her designer workout gear, inspecting everyone's front yards with her usual look of disapproval. She paused at my property line, pulling out her phone to snap pictures of my rose garden while shaking her head. Just last week, she'd left a note claiming my roses were unsightly and reducing property values. These were the same roses that had won the county gardening competition 3 years in a row. I took a deep breath, remembering the email I'd received the day before but hadn't opened yet. My confirmation as the HOA's new external auditor. The sound of screeching tires pulled me from my thoughts. Linda, Margaret's right-hand woman on the board, had just called the towing company on old Mr. Hernandez's grandson's car. The poor kid had been helping install a wheelchair ramp for his grandfather, but apparently the work truck was an eyesore, according to Linda's loud phone conversation outside my window. I carefully tucked the fee increase notice into my home office folder, right next to my certified auditor credentials and the last 6 months of questionable HOA financial statements I'd been quietly collecting. The numbers hadn't added up for a while, new landscaping charges appearing monthly despite our dying community garden, mysterious maintenance fees for non-existent repairs, and now this massive increase with only vague explanations about property improvements. Later that morning, as I walked to my mailbox, I overheard Margaret bragging to another board member about her new Tesla and upcoming kitchen renovation. Strange, considering she'd just lost her job at the real estate agency last month. Not that I was supposed to know that. Working in financial auditing gives you a knack for noticing these kinds of details. My neighbor, Emily, hurried over, looking nervous. "Did you get the notice too?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They're threatening to put a lien on my house if I can't pay the increase. But I'm a single mom. There's no way I can afford this." Her voice cracked as she held back tears. That's when Margaret's Tesla rolled up beside us. "Ladies," she called out sweetly through her open window, "I hope you're discussing the exciting new changes coming to our community. We're installing a state-of-the-art security system next week. The cameras will help us better monitor property violations." Her eyes lingered on my roses before she drove away. I smiled, knowing exactly what kind of security system she meant. I'd seen the $50,000 invoice in last month's financial records. The company providing it was owned by her brother, charging 3 times the market rate. The same brother whose landscaping company somehow won every HOA contract without any competitive bids. Walking back inside, I pulled out my laptop and opened my work email. There it was, official confirmation of my role as the HOA's external auditor, starting next week. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I typed my acceptance reply. Margaret had no idea that her perfect little kingdom was about to face its first real audit in 5 years. A knock at my door startled me. It was Mr. Hernandez, leaning heavily on his cane, holding a violation notice. "They're making me tear out the half-finished ramp," he said, his voice trembling. "They say it doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. My grandson can't help me anymore. They banned his truck. How will I even get to my doctor's appointments?" I looked past him at Margaret's house, where a team of workers was installing a massive, unapproved fountain in her front yard. Beyond that, I could see Linda measuring my rose bushes with a ruler, violation notebook in hand. It was time to start taking my own pictures. "Don't worry, Mr. Hernandez," I said, helping him to a chair on my porch. "Things around here are about to change. Would you mind telling me more about these violations? I'd like to document everything." I pulled out my voice recorder, watching as Margaret's fountain workers accidentally cracked her driveway with their truck. Funny how that violation would never make it into the HOA records. I just needed to stay quiet for 7 more days. 1 week until my first official audit meeting, where I'd have access to every financial record, every board decision, and every violation notice from the past 5 years. Margaret and her crew had no idea that their carefully constructed house of cards was sitting right next to my rose garden, and I had just the evidence to make it all come tumbling down. The question was, how many more neighbors would they crush before I could expose everything? The audit begins. My hands were sweating as I walked into the HOA office for my first day as their auditor. Margaret's fake smile dropped when I asked to see 5 years of financial records. "Oh, those old things. They're probably in storage somewhere," she said, twirling her designer handbag. I knew right then she was hiding something big. I spent the next week digging through dusty boxes in the basement. The mess of papers looked random, but I noticed something weird. Every single landscaping bill was from Collins Brothers LLC. A quick Google search showed this company belonged to Margaret's brother, and they were charging us triple the normal price for basic lawn work. While I was making copies of these sketchy bills, Linda burst into the office. "What are you doing here so late?" she snapped, trying to peek at my papers. I calmly showed her my auditor badge and watched her face turn pale. That night, I found 3 violation notices on my door, one for my garbage can being an inch too close to the curb. The next morning, I noticed something even stranger. The HOA had paid $50,000 for emergency tree removal last summer, but when I checked old Google Maps images of our neighborhood, not a single large tree was missing. I started asking neighbors about it. Old Mrs. Jenkins remembered something about Margaret's brother's company doing tree work that only took an hour. I created a spreadsheet of every weird payment I found. The numbers were shocking. $804 paying Tingasingle fire hydrant. $804 paying Tingasingle fire hydrant. $200 monthly for special security patrols that nobody had ever seen, and $55,000 for holiday decorations that never appeared. Every overpriced job went to companies connected to Margaret or her friends. Things got really interesting when I found a stack of resident complaints that had been marked, resolved, but never actually fixed. Mr. Hernandez's wheelchair ramp request was denied 3 times for aesthetic reasons, while Margaret got instant approval for her backyard tiki bar that clearly broke building codes. I was carefully photographing these documents when I heard voices in the hallway. Margaret and Linda were coming back early from lunch. I quickly slipped the papers back into place, but left a tiny thread from my sweater sticking out of the file. I needed to know if they would check these records after I left. The next morning, the thread was gone, and suddenly, all the board members were acting super nice to me. Margaret even brought me coffee and suggested I take a few days off to rest. She had no idea that I'd already made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different places. Just as I was leaving that day, a certified letter arrived for the HOA. I signed for it since I was there and nearly dropped it when I saw it was from the State Housing Authority. They wanted to audit our books too. Seems someone had tipped them off about unusually high fee increases in our neighborhood. Margaret came running out of her office when she heard my gasp, her face white as a sheet. I gathered my things to head home, wondering how long it would take her to realize I wasn't just a regular auditor. I was also the one who had contacted the housing authority 3 weeks ago. Walking to my car, I spotted Linda and Margaret having a heated whisper battle near the pool. Margaret slapped a folder into Linda's chest and pointed toward the office, her face red with anger. I smiled, knowing tomorrow would be very interesting indeed. The final showdown. The quarterly HOA meeting was packed with angry residents. Margaret stood at the podium in her designer suit, tapping her manicured nails on the wooden surface while checking her phone. I clutched my leather briefcase containing 3 months of damning evidence, taking my usual seat in the back row. As your board president, Margaret's voice dripped with fake sweetness. I must announce additional essential fee increases to maintain our community standards. She clicked through a slideshow of poorly edited photos showing supposed violations around the neighborhood. I recognized my rose garden among them, labeled as an eyesore, requiring professional intervention. Linda, her faithful sidekick, nodded enthusiastically from her front row seat, shooting me a smug look. I watched her scribble notes, probably plotting more fake violations to report. The same Linda who'd been photographed by my security camera sneaking around my property at midnight last week. My neighbor, Mrs. Martinez grabbed my hand, her eyes filling with tears. "They're going to make me sell my house," she whispered. "I can't afford another increase." I squeezed her hand back, knowing my moment had finally come. Margaret clicked to a slide showing a $50,000 proposal for new security measures, coincidentally from her husband's company. That was the last straw. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent. "Before we vote on any increases," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "I need to make an announcement." I walked to the front, pulling out my official auditor badge. "For the past 3 months, I've been serving as your external auditor, appointed by the State Housing Authority." Margaret's face turned ghost white. Linda's coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. No one moved to clean it up. I connected my laptop to the projector, bringing up my findings. I've uncovered 800,000 in questionable transactions over the past 2 years. My first slide showed Margaret sign HOA and invoices from companies tagged in Texas, including 800,000 in questionable transactions over the past 2 years. My first slide showed Margaret sign HOA and invoices from companies tagged in Texas, including 20,000 for landscaping services from a company registered to Margaret's brother for work that was never performed. The room erupted in gasps and angry mutters. Margaret lunged for my laptop, but I stepped back, continuing calmly. "I have satellite images showing no landscape changes during these supposed improvements." I clicked through more evidence: inflated invoices, personal expenses charged to the HOA, and suspicious bank transfers. "That's all lies," Margaret screeched, her composure cracking. "I've managed this community perfectly for years. Who are you to question my authority?" She turned to Linda for support, but Linda was already inching toward the exit. I projected the next slide, security footage showing Margaret and Linda entering the HOA office at 2 a.m. Last week, removing boxes of documents. "The state investigators have copies of everything," I announced. "They're very interested in the pattern of selective enforcement and personal enrichment." An elderly resident stood up, pointing his cane at Margaret. "Is this why you fined me for my medical ramp while approving your own unauthorized pool renovation?" Others joined in, sharing stories of harassment and unfair treatment. Margaret's face twisted with rage as she realized her empire was crumbling. She grabbed her designer purse and rushed toward the door, nearly knocking over Mrs. Collins, one of them said, holding up a badge. "We're from the State Housing Authority. We'd like to ask you some questions about these financial discrepancies." I turned back to the stunned residents, my voice firm but kind. "This meeting isn't over. We have a lot of work to do to restore transparency and fairness to our community." The fallout was swift. Margaret and Linda were arrested, and the state investigators uncovered even more evidence of their corruption. The HOA held new elections, and Mr. Hernandez was unanimously voted in as the new board president. My roses are blooming again, and Mr. Hernandez's wheelchair ramp was finally approved. We used the recovered funds to install accessibility features throughout the community. The local news did a follow-up story, uncovering 5 other HOAs where Margaret and Linda had pulled similar schemes. The FBI got involved, and Margaret's Tesla was seized as evidence. Turns out she'd bought it with embezzled HOA funds. As I sit on my porch today, sipping coffee and watching kids play freely in their yards without fear of random fines, I can't help but smile. The property values are actually going up now that we have honest leadership. We're planning a community garden where Margaret's brother's fake landscaping company used to dump mulch. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. It's making things right. But I still keep all my receipts, just in case. After all, the best defense against corruption is an organized spreadsheet and a good security camera. Margaret and Linda's trial starts next month. They're facing serious prison time for embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. But the real victory? Our community finally feels like home again. And my morning coffee tastes so much better without those ridiculous HOA fees.